Welcome to Soft Sleep Tales, a place where timeless stories, gentle narration, and quiet atmospheres guide you toward rest. Before tonight's story begins, you are warmly invited to share where you are listening from. In the comments below, it is always a comfort to see this quiet community reaching across the world night by night. And if these stories bring you a sense of calm, you are welcome to subscribe and join us on these peaceful journeys. Now, take a moment to get comfortable. Settle into your bed or your favorite chair. Gently close your eyes, take a slow, deep breath, and allow the day to soften and fade. Let my voice carry you quietly into sleep, to a place where imagination drifts and rest comes naturally. The work began before the church was open. This was how Marion preferred it. The building to herself, the door unlocked by the verger the evening before at her request, the key left under the stone by the south porch, where she always found it. The congregation would arrive at 9 for the Sunday service. Marion arrived at 6. She had 3 hours, not because the work required 3 hours, because the work required quiet, and quiet, in her experience, was available in churches only before the day claimed them. Once the verger arrived to light the candles, once the choir began to filter in through the vestry door, once the building acquired the particular social warmth of people preparing to be seen being good, the quality of the silence changed. It became the silence of people behaving, and that was a different thing entirely from the silence Marion needed. She was an organ tuner, had been since she was 23, when she had taken on the work from her father, after his hands had developed the shaking that made fine adjustment impossible. She was 46 now, 23 years of churches and chapels and the occasional school hall, and the one municipal concert room in Ely that had a 3-manual instrument and needed her twice a year. It was 1884, Cambridgeshire, and Marion at 6 in the morning, was unlocking the south porch door of the church of St. Etheldreda in the village of Fordwell, and stepping into the particular darkness that old stone buildings hold on to through the night, regardless of the season. She was neither tall nor slight, neither plain nor striking, but possessed that quality of absolute attention that comes to people who have spent a great part of their lives listening. Her hands were the thing people noticed first. Not beautiful hands, too large, too capable for that, with the particular callousing at the fingertips that came from years of working inside organ cases where the edges of the metal pipes were not always considered, but hands that knew what they were doing, hands that had learned their knowledge through the skin. She lit her 2 lamps and set them on the altar rail, which was close enough to the organ loft to throw useful light. Then she climbed to the loft. The organ at St. Etheldreda's was a modest instrument, 2 manuals and a pedal board, some 47 pipes, built in 1851 and tuned, according to the register she kept, by her father in 1858 and 1864 and 1871, and by herself in 1875 and 1879. This was its 3rd visit from Marion. She knew it well, its particular temperaments, its tendency to go flat in the winter months, when the stone held the cold and the metal contracted, its preference for being worked from the bass pipes inward. She opened the access panel and reached in. The interior of an organ case smells like nowhere else in the world. old wood cedar mostly, in the good instruments, and the particular mineral dustiness of metal pipes that have been vibrating for decades. Leather that has been softened and dried and softened again by the moisture of breath, because an organ breathes. That is what it does, fundamentally, what all its intricate mechanism serves. It takes a breath and holds it in the pipes and releases it as sound. Marion always allowed herself a moment when she opened a case. Not sentimental, practical, the moment of stillness that precedes careful work and makes the careful work possible. Her hands in the case, her eyes adjusted to the lamplight within, her ears open to the particular quality of a space. She was about to ask, to speak. She began with the great manual, the sea pipe, which always told her first whether the winter had been hard on the instrument. She pressed the key and listened. Flat, as expected. By how much she listened again, longer, perhaps 3 cents. Not bad for a Cambridgeshire winter. She had seen worse from this church. She had seen much worse from instruments built with cheaper metal and less care for the conditions of the building they would live in. She worked steadily through the great manual, testing, adjusting, testing again. The work required a particular kind of patience, not the patience of waiting, which is passive, but the patience of incremental action, which is its own kind of sustained attention. Each pipe adjusted by fractions, each adjustment tested, then the pipe beside it tested for the relationship between them, then the third pipe tested for the harmony of the three. An organ is a system. You cannot tune one pipe in isolation and call the work done. You tune the relationships. That is what the work is. By 7, she had moved to the swell manual. The swell was older than the great. Marion had always suspected it predated the current instrument, that it had been incorporated from an earlier organ. When the 1851 rebuild was done, the timber of its case was different, the joints were different, and several of its pipes had a quality of tone that the newer pipes lacked. Something slightly rougher, slightly more human, the quality of metal that had been worked by an earlier hand with slightly different methods. She worked on the swell with particular care. The older pipes could be unpredictable. What they gave up in consistency, they gained in character, and Marion had learned over 23 years to negotiate with the character of old pipes, rather than simply imposing the tuning on them. You listened to what they wanted to be, and then you worked toward that, within the requirements of the key. At 7:30, she reached the back of the swell. The pipes here were the smallest. The upper register, the pipes that produced the highest notes, thin as pencils, some of them barely wider than her thumb. She worked carefully in the confined space, her lamp set as close as was safe. It was here that she found it. At first she thought it was a repair. Something had been fixed to the rear wall of the swell case, between the back rank of pipes and the timber panelling. A small strip of metal, perhaps 4 inches long and 1 inch wide, fastened with 2 small pins into the wood. She moved her lamp closer. Not a repair. Not a structural element. The metal was different from the pipe metal. Flatter, darker, worked differently. And on its surface, covering most of its 4 inches, something had been cut. Notes. not decoration, not a maker's mark, which she had seen before on instruments of this age, a stamped name or a symbol pressed into the metal. Notes, musical notation, cut into the surface of the metal with something fine-pointed, a needle perhaps, or a very small engraving tool, with a care and precision that spoke of someone who had taken considerable time over this. She brought the lamp so close that the heat of it touched her hand. She could read music. She had been reading music since she was 8 years old, when her father had begun teaching her the theory of the instruments she would one day tend. She could read this. 8 bars, cut into a strip of metal, 4 inches long, minuscule but precise. The staff lines ruled with something that had left a clean mark, the note heads formed with a steadiness that suggested the hand had not faltered. Treble clef, no time signature, no key signature, simply 8 bars of melody, beginning and ending without context, as though cut from the middle of something longer. She read it through once in her head. The melody was simple, not simple as in easy, simple as in unornamented, as in stripped to its essential movement. It moved stepwise mostly, small intervals, with one wider leap near the 5th bar that she read and felt in her throat before she understood why. It was not written for organ. She knew this immediately and with certainty. 23 years of working with organ music had given her a knowledge of what the instrument wanted, its natural idiom, the shapes that suited it, the intervals and rhythms that let it speak in its own voice. This was not that. This was written for a voice, a human voice. The intervals breathed. The phrases shaped themselves around the shape of a breath. Even the wider leap in bar 5. That was a singer's leap, the kind that a voice makes willingly, and that an organ produces only by mechanical necessity. She sat back on her heels in the organ loft and looked at the metal strip for a long time. Someone had hidden this here, or not hidden, placed inside an organ case, in the back of the swell, where it would only be found by someone who opened the case entirely. Not a place that was never seen, a place that was rarely seen, a place that was seen only by the person who came to tend the instrument. Marion looked at the 2 small pins that held the strip to the wood. They were the same pins used to secure the pipe feet. Whoever placed this had known what they were doing, had understood the inside of an organ case, had known which pins to use, and where to place the strip so that it would not interfere with the pipes. Had been, in other words, an organ person, someone who knew this instrument, someone who had been where she was standing. She looked at the pipes around the strip. The older pipes, the swell pipes she had been thinking of as possibly older than the 1851 rebuild. If the swell had come from an earlier instrument, then the strip could have been placed there before 1851, could have been in this church, inside this case, for 30 years, or longer. She sat in the organ loft as the light outside the high windows began to change, the winter dark releasing its grip, the cold grey of early morning giving way, to something slightly warmer, still grey but with a suggestion of the day in it. 8 o'clock. She had 1 hour before the verger. She finished tuning the swell. She could not simply stop because she had found something unexpected. The organ had been called to be played today, and it needed to be ready. This was her responsibility, and she discharged it with the same attention she had brought to the first pipe. But she worked with the strip in her peripheral awareness, present in her mind the way a piece of music is present. When you have heard it once and your mind keeps returning to it without being asked. 8 bars of melody, written for a voice, hidden in the back of a Cambridgeshire church organ, put there by someone who understood what they were putting it inside, left for someone who would understand what they were finding. She moved to the pedal board. She tuned the sub-bass pipes one by one. She listened. She adjusted. She listened again. And all the while, the 8 bars moved quietly in the back of her mind, the melody making its small, patient shape, in the silence behind her attention, waiting. She had been doing this work since she was 23, and the one thing it had taught her above all others, above the theory, above the practical knowledge of pipes and bellows and the behavior of metal in cold air, was how to be alone without being lonely. The work required solitude, not the chosen solitude of someone who prefers their own company, the professional solitude of someone whose work demands silence, and whose work demands it because silence is the medium in which the work operates. You cannot hear what you are tuning if you cannot hear. This had suited Marion Cross from the beginning. She was not, by nature, a person who filled silence unnecessarily. She had her father's quality in this, the quality of a craftsperson who understands that the work asks something of you, and that what it asks first is your full attention. Nothing else while the work is happening. No second thoughts, no half attention, no maintenance of a conversation, with the part of your mind not currently occupied by the problem at hand. All of it. The work gets all of it. Her father had been the same. She had grown up watching him work, in churches, in chapels, occasionally in the great hall of a house, whose owners wanted their instrument properly maintained and were willing to pay for the skill to do it. She had sat in pews and watched him disappear into organ cases, with his lamp and his tools, and reappear an hour later, with the particular settled look of someone who has done something correctly. She had known, watching him, that this was the work she wanted to do, not decided to want, simply wanted, the way you want things that are already part of you before you know to name them. She thought about this sometimes, about the difference between the life she had and the life she might have had if she had not been her father's daughter, or not the daughter of this particular father, a man who had no son, and who had, apparently without difficulty, decided that a daughter who wanted to learn was as good as a son who might have wanted to. She was aware this was not always the case. She had encountered, over 23 years of this work, a number of people who found her presence in an organ case surprising or incorrect or both. She had responded to each of them with the same quiet efficiency, not with argument, because argument was not what the situation required. The situation required that the organ be tuned correctly. She tuned it correctly, and then, in most cases, the surprise and the incorrectness dissolved. The work spoke for itself. She had learned to rely on this, to trust it, to do the work as well as she knew how, and allow it to make whatever case was needed. The swell pipes were done. She moved her lamp back, and in doing so caught the strip of metal once more in the edge of the light. The small rectangle with its precise notation, its 8 bars waiting in the dark. She looked at it for another moment. Then she climbed out of the case and moved to the pedal board. The sub-bass pipes required her full attention. She gave it. But the melody stayed. That was the thing about music in the memory. It did not ask permission to remain. It simply did. And this melody, with its careful, stepwise movement, and its single wider leap in bar 5, and its way of shaping itself around a breath rather than a bellows, this melody, Marion Cross was already quite certain, would stay for a long time. The verger arrived at 8:05. Marion was already descended from the loft, and sitting in the 3rd pew from the front, her tools packed and her lamp extinguished, looking at the organ case from below. She did this sometimes at the end of a job, simply looked at the instrument from the congregation's perspective, which was a perspective she rarely had. The verger, a thin man of 60 who had the air of someone who had been surprised by nothing in the last 20 years and did not expect to be surprised again, nodded at her and began his preparations. She nodded back. This was the entirety of their usual communication, and it had served them both well across 3 visits. She thought about the strip of metal, about the fact that the verger, who had presumably been in this church for many years, who had presumably been in the loft many times, who might or might not have looked inside the swell case, had never mentioned it, almost certainly did not know it was there. That was the nature of the inside of an organ case. You could be in a church your whole life and never know what was in it, not because it was hidden from you exactly, because you had no reason to look, because the inside of the case was not a place that belonged to the congregation, or the verger, or the vicar. It belonged to the instrument, and to the tuner who came to attend to it. Marion stood, picked up her bag, and walked out of St. Etheldreda's into the February morning. The cold came at her from the flat Cambridgeshire fields on both sides, the kind of cold that had no malice in it, simply the fact of itself. She walked, and under the cold and the ordinary sounds of a village beginning its Sunday, the melody moved quietly forward, bar by bar, as it would for months. She copied the notation before she left. Not onto paper, she had not thought to bring paper that morning, into her memory, which for Marion Cross was a different kind of paper, one that she had been writing music into since childhood, and that had proven, over 46 years, considerably more reliable than the kind that got damp. She stood in front of the strip for 2 minutes, the lamp held steady in her left hand, her right hand conducting the melody very slightly, the small involuntary movement of a musician reading, the fingers tracing the shape of what the eyes take in. 8 bars. She had it. She did not remove the strip. She had considered it, stood for a moment with the question, take it or leave it. But the strip was fastened with pins into the timber of the organ case, and removing it would leave 2 small holes in the wood. That would require explanation. More than that, it had been placed, with intention, with understanding of where it was, inside an organ that was still in use in a church that was still in use. Taking it felt wrong, in the way of taking something that was not hers to take, even though no one else knew it was there. She closed the case. She descended from the loft. She sat for a few minutes in a pew near the south wall, while the church filled slowly with its Sunday morning sounds, the verger's footsteps on the stone flags, the creak of the vestry door, the first voices of the choir arriving in the cold. She sat with the melody in her memory, listening to it the way you listen to something you have not yet understood but are beginning to. Then the vicar appeared and thanked her, and asked if the instrument was satisfactory, and Marion said yes, satisfactory, and walked out into the Cambridgeshire morning. The village of Fordwell was small, smaller than most of the places Marion worked, a high street of perhaps 30 buildings, a school, a public house, a post office that was also the general shop, and the church of St. Etheldreda at the western end, with its square tower and its modest organ, and its small strip of metal in the back of the swell case. Marion walked the high street slowly, as she always did when she arrived in a new place. Not new, she had been to Fordwell twice before, but the practice of walking a place was the practice of understanding it, and she had not walked Fordwell with this question in mind before. The question was, who, in this village or connected to it, would have had reason to write 8 bars of melody for a human voice and place them inside an organ case? The possibilities were limited by the nature of the act. Whoever did it had access to the church, had access to the organ, had enough knowledge of the instrument to place the strip correctly without damaging anything, had the manual skill to engrave music into metal with the precision she had seen, and had a reason, some reason, to put music in a place where it would only be found by the person who tuned the organ. Not a parishioner, then, not simply someone who attended services. The knowledge of the inside of the swell case was too specific for that. An organist? Someone who played this instrument regularly would know its interior, not as well as a tuner, but well enough to understand where the strip would sit safely. She would need to know who the organists had been. The current organist was a young man named Hartley, who had been in the village for 3 years, and who Marion thought of, whenever she saw his playing in the register, as someone who treated the organ as a piece of furniture. Not Hartley. Before Hartley? She did not know. The parish register of organists would be in the vestry. She had not thought to look this morning. She had been occupied with other things. She found the vicar in his garden after the service. He was a mild man of 60, who had the pleasant absent-mindedness of someone who has organized his inner life to his satisfaction and finds the external world a mild and manageable place as a result. She asked him about the organ's history, about its organists, about when the swell case had been built. He thought for a moment. The current instrument dated from 1851, he said. Before that there had been an older instrument. He believed parts of it had been incorporated into the rebuild, but he could not be certain. He suggested the church warden's log, which went back to 1833, and which was kept in the vestry chest. He did not know it well himself. He said this with the comfortable honesty of a man who understands that knowing the history of a chest is a different kind of knowledge from knowing the chest's importance. He let her into the vestry. She spent an hour with the church warden's log. The log was a large, leather-bound volume, its entries in various hands over 50 years, the record of the ordinary and occasionally extraordinary business of maintaining a small Cambridgeshire church. roof repairs, bell maintenance, the arrival and departure of vicars and curates, births and deaths recorded not in the register. That was separate, but in the casual notations of church wardens, who marked what seemed notable to them at the time. She found the organ. Entry from 1851. The new instrument installed this May, 2 manuals and pedals, the swell cabinet, and 4 ranks of pipes retained from the old instrument at the recommendation of Mr. Percy Dodd, tuner, who advised that these pipes were of exceptional quality. Entry from 1863. Miss Evelyn Marsh appointed to the organ, succeeding Mr. Good, who has removed to Ely. Entry from 1871. Miss Marsh resigned the organ on account of her removal to Norwich. It was noted that she had served the instrument for 8 years with great distinction. Marion read this twice. Miss Evelyn Marsh, organist from 1863 to 1871. 8 years. The strip was in the back of the swell. The swell had been retained from the older instrument. Miss Marsh had played this organ for 8 years and would have known it thoroughly. Known the swell, known its pipes, known the back of the case. And she had a name now, a name and a destination, removed to Norwich. Marion sat in the vestry with the log on her lap and thought about Evelyn Marsh, about someone who had played this organ for 8 years and then left, about 8 bars of melody written for a human voice and fixed inside the instrument that she had played, left there for whoever came next to tend it. Why? That was the question that did not yet have an answer. Not who, not how. Why had Evelyn Marsh placed music inside an organ case? Music written for a voice, not for the instrument itself. Music that could not be played by the organ it was hidden in. Marion walked home through the February afternoon. Her work was done here until the next visit, which she would schedule for the autumn. She had 2 other churches this week, a chapel in Ely on Tuesday, and the school hall at March on Thursday. The work continued as it always continued, and within it, underneath it, the 8 bars moved in their quiet, patient way. She hummed the melody as she walked. The first time she had done so, it surprised her. She had not decided to hum it. It had simply emerged, the way music emerges when the mind has been holding it, without being asked to, and finally releases it through the voice. She let it continue. Walking the Cambridgeshire lane in the February cold, the bare hedgerows on both sides, the flat grey sky above, she hummed the melody of a woman she had never met, cut into metal, hidden in the back of a swell case, waiting in the dark for 13 years. It sounded, she thought, like something that had waited a long time. It sounded exactly like that. She began, in the days that followed, to think about what the melody was. Not in the analytical sense. She had heard it enough times in her head now to have analyzed its structure without trying. 8 bars, no key signature, the tonality ambiguous, not unresolved, but deliberately unanchored, as though it were a fragment of something longer, whose home key would only become clear in the full context. In the thinking sense, what kind of thing was this? A song without words? A voice part from something larger, a part song, perhaps, or the soprano line of a hymn she did not know? something composed by Evelyn Marsh herself, if she was indeed the one who had put it there, or something she had loved and transcribed, taken from a larger piece and reduced to these 8 bars for reasons Marion could not yet determine? She thought about the ambiguity of the tonality. A fragment, that was what it felt like, not the beginning of something. There was no strong opening gesture, no establishing phrase, not the end. There was no sense of arrival, no resolution. The middle, these were 8 bars from the middle of something. Why the middle? If you were going to cut music into a strip of metal and hide it in an organ case, why would you choose the middle? Why not a complete piece? Why not at least a beginning or an ending? Unless, Marion thought, the person who found it was supposed to know the rest, was supposed to recognize it, was supposed to hear these 8 bars and know what they came from and what came before and after them. Not a message to a stranger, a message to someone specific, a message to someone who would understand these 8 bars and know their context. Marion did not know their context. She had heard a great deal of music in her 46 years. An organ tuner's working life encompasses an enormous range of what is played and what is worth playing, but she did not recognize this melody, which meant perhaps that the message had not reached the person it was intended for, that the specific someone who was supposed to recognize these 8 bars had never opened the back of the swell case, had never stood where Marion had stood, with the lamp and the confined space, and the melody waiting in the metal, or that the message was older than the person it was meant for, that it had been waiting so long that the intended recipient was no longer there to receive it. She thought about this all week, at the chapel in Ely, tuning a small but fine instrument, while the rain came off the fens and drummed against the high windows, at the school hall in March, working on an upright harmonium that had been treated with considerably less care than it deserved. She thought about it in the evenings in her rooms in Cambridge, where she had lived alone since her father had died 12 years ago, and the house they had shared had become too large for one person and too full of someone who was not there. She sat at the table in her sitting room with the lamp and the tea and a sheet of paper on which she had written the 8 bars out. Her own notation now, taken from memory, in her own hand. She looked at it. She sang it quietly. She wrote below it, in small letters, Evelyn Marsh, Fordwell, 1863 to 1871. Removed to Norwich. She was going to Norwich in April. She had a cathedral instrument to service, and a school chapel and 2 parish churches. She would be there for a week. Norwich was not so large a city that a woman who had been its church organist somewhere, at some point, could not be found. If Evelyn Marsh was still there, if she was still alive. She sat back and looked at what she had written. Evelyn Marsh, 8 years in Fordwell, a girl named Alice who had a particular voice. Marion had her own version of this kind of thing. Not the same. Nothing about loss was the same as another person's loss. But the shape of it, the shape of something that had been aimed at a person, and had not arrived because the person was no longer where they had been. There had been a man, at 22, who had asked a question she had not been able to answer as he hoped. She had known what she was choosing, not the work exactly she had not known, then, that she would take it over from her father, that the work would become hers as fully as it had. She had known only that she was not finished yet with the thing she was in the middle of becoming, and that she needed to be somewhere that permitted that. She did not grieve the other life, but she knew its shape. She carried it the way Evelyn Marsh had carried the piece on her piano stand, not playing it, sometimes simply looking, understanding that some things did not need to be put down to be at peace with, only held in their right proportion, understood for what they were. Marion folded the paper and put it in the pocket of her work bag, which went everywhere she went. Then she made herself a second cup of tea and sat in the lamplight of her sitting room and sang the 8 bars one more time, quietly, to herself, in the particular silence of a house that holds one person and knows it. The melody moved through the room and found the corners of it and settled there like something that had been looking for a place to land and had, for now, found one. At the chapel in Ely on Tuesday morning, she found herself listening differently, not to the instrument she was tuning that required its usual focused attention, and she gave it, but in the spaces between the testing and the adjusting, in the brief silences after a pipe was played and before the next was approached, she was listening for the melody, listening to see whether the 8 bars, when she played them in her head against the background of a different instrument, sounded different. They did not. They were exactly themselves, regardless of where she heard them, which told her something about their nature. A melody that held its own against context was a melody that had been given its essential shape, rather than assembled from borrowed materials. This was composed, she was increasingly certain, not transcribed from something known, made. The question was by whom. She had Evelyn Marsh as the most likely candidate, the organist with access to the swell case, the connection to her father who had been the tuner, the 8 years of close familiarity with the instrument. But she also acknowledged that she was building a theory from limited evidence, and that the person who placed the strip might not be the same person who composed the music on it. She turned this over while she tuned, the methodical work of the Ely Chapel going forward, with its usual efficiency, and alongside it, quietly, the slow turning of the question. The harmonium in March was a different matter, a school instrument, subjected to decades of enthusiastic and imprecise use, its reed plates worn unevenly, 2 of the bass keys sticking in a way that would require more than tuning to correct. She dealt with what she could deal with and wrote a clear note to the school's music master, explaining what further work the instrument required and what would happen if that work was not done. She had written many such notes over the years. Most of them were acted upon eventually. Some were not. She wrote them anyway. The instrument deserved that someone had said so. On Thursday evening she sat at her table in Cambridge, with the 8 bars on paper before her, and the name Evelyn Marsh below them, and the note removed to Norwich. She added, Church Warden's log at Fordwell, swell pipes retained from earlier instrument, organist, 1863 to 1871. Father showed her the case. Then she sat back and read what she had written. It was the shape of something, not the whole shape yet, but the shape was there, and in April she would go to Norwich and find out whether the rest of it was the shape she thought it was. She made her second cup of tea. She folded the paper carefully and put it in the work bag. Then she sat in the lamplit silence of her room and thought about the inside of organ cases, all the ones she had been in, all the ones she had not, all the things they contained or might contain. An instrument held its history inside it, not in the pipes themselves, exactly, though the pipes changed over time and bore the evidence of change. In the whole accumulated interior, the dust of decades, the marks of repairs, the adjustments made by every tuner who had ever worked the instrument, each one leaving their small trace in the slightly different pitch of a pipe or the grain of the timber where they had braced themselves. And now, in one particular instrument, a strip of metal with 8 bars of melody on it, a different kind of mark, a mark that said, "I was here. I put something in the keeping of this instrument. I trusted it to hold." Marion sang the melody one last time, very softly, as she always did before she slept. Then she put out the lamp and went to bed and let the melody settle into the particular quiet of a house that holds one person and the accumulated music of 23 working years. Norwich in April smelled of the river, not unpleasantly. The Wensum in spring had a particular quality, the cold mineral smell of water that has been moving through flat land all winter and is beginning, reluctantly, to warm. It came into the streets from the east and mixed with the coal smoke of the city's morning and the yeast smell from the brewery near Fye Bridge into something that was neither pleasant nor unpleasant, but simply April in Norwich, unmistakable. Marion had been here twice before. The cathedral instrument, the parish rounds. She knew the smell of the city in the mornings and the particular sound of it, the cathedral bells marking the quarter hour, and the market starting up by 8, and the pigeons on the cathedral steps, moving in their unhurried circles. She did not know it in the way of someone who lived here. She knew it in the way of someone who came and worked and left, the tuner's knowledge, gathered in patches, always partial, always enough. Marion arrived on a Monday evening and went directly to the cathedral the next morning. The cathedral instrument was the reason she had been invited, a large 4-manual organ of considerable age and complexity that required 3 days of careful work. She began at 6. She worked until the first service at 8, then again from 9 to 12, then again in the afternoon. She was methodical and thorough, and the cathedral staff left her alone, which was the ideal arrangement. On the 3rd afternoon, when the cathedral work was finished and the instrument was settled and speaking correctly, she went to the cathedral library. She had spent the 3 days deciding how to find Evelyn Marsh, or find out about her, or find out whether she was still alive and still in Norwich. The logic was straightforward. Evelyn Marsh had been a church organist. She had removed from Fordwell to Norwich at some point around 1871. If she had continued her work as an organist in Norwich, and the church warden's log had described her as someone with great distinction, she would be known. Norwich had many churches. Someone in the cathedral would know the significant organists. The cathedral librarian was a small, precise man of 50 who received Marion's question with the alert attention of someone who keeps records professionally and is accustomed to the specific pleasure of being asked about them. He knew the name immediately. Miss Evelyn Marsh, he said. She had played at St. John Maddermarket for 14 years, retired from the organ, he believed, in 1884. She would be, he thought, perhaps 60 years old now, still in Norwich, to his knowledge, on Collegate, near the river. Marion thanked him. She walked to Collegate. She heard the river before she saw it, the sound of moving water finding the gaps between the buildings, low and continuous, the Wensum doing its indifferent work. The street itself smelled of it, that cold mineral river smell, stronger here than in the cathedral quarter, closer to the water. And then the house. The house on Collegate was narrow and brick-fronted, one of a terrace, with a small brass plate by the door, not a business plate, just a name plate, the kind a person of modest means and particular habits keeps on their door because they have always done so. She knocked. The woman who answered was small and upright, with a face that had been fine and was still fine in the manner of faces that have aged into their strongest features. White hair, cut short and practical, hands that Marion recognized immediately, the hands of someone who has spent their life at a keyboard, the particular way a musician's hands rest, slightly curved even in repose, as though the keys were close and might be needed. "Miss Marsh?" Marion said. The woman looked at her. Her eyes were dark and still, and gave nothing away unnecessarily. "Yes," she said, and then, after a pause, "Are you from a church?" "I am an organ tuner," Marion said. "I tune the instrument at St. Etheldreda's in Fordwell. I was there in February." Something shifted in Evelyn Marsh's expression. Not much. The way a very small change in temperature can be perceived without being visible. She stood in the doorway for a moment. Then she opened the door wider. "Come in," she said. The parlour was small and very tidy, and contained, along one wall, an upright piano. Not a showpiece. The kind of piano that a person of limited space and unlimited need for music chooses as the practical compromise between wanting and having. On its music stand, open, a piece of music. Marion did not look at it directly. They sat in the two chairs near the window. Miss Marsh poured tea that was already made. She had clearly been expecting no visitor, but the tea was there as though she lived beside the possibility of one. "You found it?" Miss Marsh said. Not a question. "Yes," Marion said. The older woman looked at her hands. Her fingers moved very slightly. The musician's involuntary motion, the keyboard reflex. "How long has it been there? Do you know?" "The log says you left Fordwell in 1871, Marion said. "I believe it was there when you left." Evelyn Marsh nodded. 13 years, she said, almost exactly. She picked up her cup, set it down without drinking. Then she said, "I did not know if anyone would find it. I did not know if the instrument would survive. Churches replace their organs. I was never certain it would still be there." "But you placed it?" Marion said, knowing it might not be found. "Yes, knowing it might not be found." She was quiet for a moment. Outside, the April light moved through the window, in the particular way of East Anglian light that distributed everywhere at once quality that made the room feel open. I was in Fordwell for 8 years, Evelyn Marsh said. I came there after my father died. I had been teaching music in Cambridge, and when he died, I needed to be somewhere smaller and quieter for a while. I was offered the organ at St. Etheldreda's, and I took it. I thought I would stay a year or two. I stayed 8. She paused. The light shifted. The piano stood along the wall with its open music. In 1867, I was teaching a girl called Alice Redman. She was 15. A voice, a particular voice, the kind you hear once in a generation perhaps, if you are fortunate. She paused. I had been composing, small things. I was never ambitious in that direction, and I had written a piece for her voice. She had been my student for 2 years. She had just turned 17. I was going to give it to her to sing. Marion waited. She had learned, from long years of working in silence, when to wait and when to ask. This was a time for waiting. She died, Evelyn Marsh said simply. In December of 1867, a fever, very quickly. She paused again, 3 weeks after I had finished the piece. Marion looked at her hands, the way a person looks at their hands when there is nothing else to look at, and looking at the other person feels like too much. I did not destroy it. Evelyn Marsh continued. I could not, but I could not keep it either. Not in the ordinary way, not on paper in a drawer. That felt wrong. She had never sung it. It was incomplete in a way that paper seemed too ordinary to hold. She looked out the window. I had been thinking about the organ, about the swell case and the older pipes, which I had loved most of all the instruments' voices. They had a particular quality, those old pipes, something the newer pipes didn't have. I had been in the back of the swell case several times when the tuner came and allowed me to watch. She paused. Your father came, I think, an older man. My father, Marion said. Yes. He let me watch, Evelyn Marsh said. He was kind about it. He showed me the pipes, how to read the construction of the case. After he left, I went back in myself and looked at the timber. I knew it could hold something. I knew where to put it without causing harm. She picked up her cup and this time drank from it. I took the 8 bars that seemed to me the heart of the piece, she said. Not the beginning, not the end, the heart, where her voice would have opened into its full quality. I engraved them onto a piece of metal with a tool my father had used for his watchmaking, which I had kept, and I fixed them to the timber. I used the same pins as the pipe feet. I wanted it to be part of the instrument, part of what the organ held. Marion looked at the piano on the wall, at the music on the stand. Is that it? She asked. The piece. Evelyn Marsh followed her gaze. Yes, she said. I have been looking at it today. Not for any reason, simply looking. She paused. I had forgotten that I used to do that sometimes. Just look at it, not play it. Look. They sat for a while in the April light, the river visible through the window. In the distance, the Wensum moving through the city, with its indifferent patience. 2 women in a small parlour, in a terrace house in Norwich, with a piano and a cup of tea and 8 bars of music. Between them, that had been inside a Cambridgeshire church organ for 13 years. Marion thought about what to say. She had a number of things she might say. Some of them were true, but beside the point. Some were kind, but insufficient. She thought about what she actually believed, about what the 8 bars had meant to her since February, the way she had carried them, the way the melody had lived in her. "I have been singing it," she said, "since I found it. Not intentionally. It simply happened. I would find myself humming it, walking, mostly." She paused. "It is the heart of something. I could feel that, even without knowing the whole." Evelyn Marsh looked at her. Her expression was very still. Then she said, "Would you like to hear it?" "The whole piece?" "Yes." Marion put down her cup. "Yes," she said. "I would like that very much." She worked at the 2 parish churches the following day. The first was a small and ancient building on a side street, whose organ was modest but well maintained, and presented no difficulties. The second was larger, with an instrument that had been poorly treated by the previous tuner, whoever that had been, and required considerable patience to correct. She gave it what it needed. She always did. But her mind was in the parlour on Colleget, in the particular quality of Evelyn Marsh's stillness when she had turned to face Marion, in the expression that had been on her face when she sat at the piano, not the expression of someone performing, not even the expression of someone remembering, the expression of someone returning, going back to a place they had not visited in a long time, and finding it still there. Marion thought about what it meant to write something for a person and have that person die before they could receive it. She had no direct experience of this. She had never composed music. She tended other people's compositions. She did not create her own. But she understood the principle, the thing made for a specific person, that the specific person never received. What you did with that, how you carried it. Evelyn Marsh had found a way. She had put the heart of the piece inside the instrument she knew best, inside the instrument she loved, not to hide it, to keep it, in a place where it would be found, eventually, by someone who understood what they were finding, by someone like Marion's father, by someone like Marion herself. She thought about her father. He had tuned the Fordwell organ in 1858 and 1864 and 1871. The strip had been placed sometime in the years Evelyn Marsh was organist, 1863 to 1871, which meant her father might have found it, might have opened the back of the swell case in 1864 or 1871 and found the strip, and if he had found it, he had said nothing to Marion about it, had left it where it was, had put the case back together and made no record. Or perhaps he had not noticed it. He had been older by 1871, the shaking already beginning in his hands, his attention perhaps less fine than it had been. Or perhaps he had noticed it and thought it none of his business. A tuner's business was the pipes. Not everything inside the case was the tuner's to question. Marion filed these possibilities away. She would not know. Her father had been dead for 12 years. Some questions were closed simply by time. She had made her peace with this, across 12 years of working without him. The second parish church's organ yielded eventually to the sustained attention she gave it. She finished in the early afternoon, packed her tools, and walked back toward the station through Norwich, past the cathedral, past the market square with its colour and noise, past the narrow medieval streets that the city had never quite rationalised. She passed the end of Colligate and glanced down it. The street looked ordinary. Brick terraces, the Wensum at the end catching the afternoon light. In a house in this street, a woman of 60 sat with a piano and a piece of music on its stand that she had written for a girl who died. Marion walked on. The train to Cambridge, the walk home from the station, the lamp and the kettle and the evening. She sat at her table and took out the copied pages and looked at them for a long time. The whole piece, now in her possession, not ownership. Possession was different. A thing was in your possession when it was yours to keep, because you were the right keeper of it at this particular time. And Marion Cross, in April of 1884, was the right keeper of this music. She sang through the whole piece again, not quietly, with the confidence of someone who knows a piece well enough to trust it. The melody moved through her sitting room in Cambridge in the April evening and found the walls of it and settled. She would return to Fordwell in the autumn. She would open the swell case again. She would find the strip still there. Of course it would be there. And then she would sit in the organ loft with the September morning coming through the windows, and she would know what to do. She already knew. She had known, sitting in the parlour in Colligate, watching Evelyn Marsh's hands return to a piano after many years of not playing this. She had known from the way the music had moved through the room, quietly, without performance, the way music moves when it has been kept a long time and is finally being given air. Some music needs to be played. Some music needs to be sung. These are different things, and this was music for a voice. It had always been music for a voice. And in the autumn, in St. Etheldrada's, before anyone else arrived, it would finally have one. Evelyn Marsh sat at the piano. She did not adjust the stool or arrange her music, or make any of the small preparatory rituals that musicians perform before they play. She simply sat, placed her hands on the keys, began. The room was very still. Outside, the Wensum moved past the end of Colligate with its usual indifference. Inside, the first note entered the air. Marion had carried 8 bars in her memory for 2 months. She had understood from them that the whole would be particular, had known this the way you know from a few measures of something, whether the whole will justify the fragment. She had not known what particular would mean. Now she did. The piece was not long, 4 minutes, perhaps a little less. A solo voice part, written with an accompaniment in mind. You could hear the space for it, the piano playing only the melodic line, the right hand carrying the voice, the left hand silent, the room holding both. Marion sat very still. When the 8 bars arrived, in the third phrase, just where Evelyn Marsh had said, at the heart of it, she felt them the way she had felt them in the organ case, the way you feel music that has found the exact shape of something you had not known needed finding. The piece ended quietly, a descent of 3 notes and then a silence. Not an ending that resolved, an ending that accepted. There was a difference. Evelyn Marsh took her hands from the keys and rested them in her lap. She did not turn around. Marion did not speak immediately. She allowed the silence its proper duration, which she felt she owed both the music and the woman who had written it. When the room had settled, she said, "It is extraordinary." Evelyn Marsh turned slightly, not all the way, still half facing the piano, the way a person sits who has not quite returned from where the music took them. "I have not played it for many years," she said. "Not since, perhaps since I left Fordwell." "You carried it with you?" Marion said. "The whole piece, on the stand." Evelyn Marsh looked at the piano. "I have always carried it," she said, "in one form or another." She paused. "I simply did not always play it." Marion thought about the strip of metal in the organ case, about the 8 bars that had lived in the dark for 13 years, about the woman in front of her who had put them there, and then come to Norwich, and lived with the piece on her piano stand, without playing it. "Why the organ?" Marion asked. She had wanted to ask this since February. Not why an instrument, why that particular one. Evelyn Marsh considered this. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, Alice had never heard the organ at St. Etheldrada's. She had never been inside the church. She lived on the east side of the village, and her family were Methodists. The organ was mine in a way it was no one else's. I played it every Sunday. I knew it. I loved it, particularly the old pipes. It seemed right to put something of hers into something of mine, something that would last. She turned fully to face Marion now. Her expression was the expression of someone who has just said something true that they have not said before. "I did not think of it as a secret," she said. "Not exactly. I thought of it as a keeping." She paused. "Do you understand the difference?" Marion thought about all the instruments she had opened over 23 years. All the organ cases she had been inside, the pipes and the leather and the cedar and the smell, the things she had found inside them. Mostly nothing, mostly only the instrument and its accumulated dust and the evidence of previous work, but occasionally other things. A name scratched by an apprentice, a builder's note sealed in the timber, the small marks that people leave inside things when they understand that the inside of things is a different kind of place from the outside. "Yes," she said, "I think I do." They talked for another hour about the organ at St. Etheldrada's, its condition, the quality of the old pipes, about Fordwell and what Marion knew of it, about the work of tuning, which Evelyn Marsh asked about with the genuine interest of someone who had once been shown the inside of an organ case by a kind older man and had never forgotten it. They talked about Alice Redman, not extensively. Evelyn Marsh said what she said with the economy of someone who has long since found the form of words that can carry the weight without requiring them to carry it again and again. A bright girl, serious about music. The kind of student you teach once in a career, perhaps, if you are fortunate. Marion listened to all of this the way she listened to a pipe being tuned, with full attention and without interruption. Before she left, Marion asked if she might copy the piece, the whole piece, not just the 8 bars she already had. She said this carefully. She understood it was a significant thing to ask. Evelyn Marsh looked at the music on the stand for a long moment. "Yes," she said, "I would like that." She paused. "I had thought, once, that I might try to have it published as a song, but it seemed wrong in a way I could not entirely explain. It was written for a voice that no longer existed. Putting it in a publisher's catalogue felt like putting it in a place it did not belong. But for you to have it," she said, and she spoke this next part quietly, as though she were working out what she believed as she said it. "You who found the 8 bars and carried them for 2 months and came to Norwich to find where they came from. That seems right. That seems like the right kind of passing on." Marion copied the piece at the table by the window. Evelyn Marsh made fresh tea and sat in her chair and did not watch, which was the right instinct. Marion worked carefully, as she worked at everything, checking each bar against the original as she went. When she came to the 8 bars in the 3rd phrase, she slowed slightly, without meaning to, and felt the familiar small lift of recognition. She folded the copied pages and put them in her work bag. She left on the Tuesday morning, 2 parish churches to visit before she took the train home. She shook hands with Evelyn Marsh at the door of the house on Collegate and said that she would leave the strip in the organ case when she returned to Fordwell. Miss Marsh nodded. "Yes," she said, "leave it there. It belongs to the instrument now." Marion walked to the first church through the April city. The Wensum caught the morning light and gave it back in pieces. The streets were full of the ordinary traffic of a Tuesday. The carts and the tradespeople and the school children and the pigeons on the cathedral steps. She walked through it all with the work bag over her shoulder and the copied pages inside it, and the melody moving in her as it had been moving since February. Not a burden, a companion. The way music becomes a companion when it has lived in you long enough. That autumn she returned to St. Etheldreda's. 6 in the morning, the key under the stone by the south porch, the church holding its night cool against the September morning. She lit her lamps. She climbed to the loft. She opened the swell case. The strip was there. Of course it was there. She had known it would be there. But there was still something in the seeing of it. The small metal rectangle with its careful notation, undisturbed, exactly where she had found it 8 months before, that required a moment. She touched it lightly with one finger. Then she began to tune. The work took the usual time, the usual care, the great manual, then the swell, then the pedals, the familiar conversation with the familiar instrument. The flat pipe brought back to pitch, the relationships between the pipes restored to their proper harmony, the organ made ready to speak again. And when the work was done, before she closed the case, she sat in the organ loft in the early September morning, and she sang the whole piece, not quietly, not with the held-back diffidence of a person unsure of their voice in a public space. She sang it properly, to the church, to the stone walls and the high windows, and the old pipes in the swell case that had carried its 8 bars since 1871. Her voice was not remarkable. She was an organ tuner, not a singer, but she knew the piece by now, knew it in the way you know something. You have carried long enough for it to become part of you. She knew it the way she knew the pipes she had tuned for 23 years. In the hands, in the throat, in the skin. The piece moved through the church. The stone received it and gave it back, slightly altered. The reverb of old limestone, the way that particular building held sound, longer in the upper register, warmer in the lower. It was not what the piece had been written for. It was not Alice Redmond's voice, in a room with an accompaniment, and the particular quality that a 17-year-old's voice would have brought to it. It was something else, something that was also its own kind of right. Marion closed the swell case. She descended from the loft. She sat for a few minutes in her usual pew and listened to the silence, the particular silence of a church after music, not empty, full, the silence of a space that has just been asked to hold something and has held it. The verger arrived at 8. The choir arrived at past. The congregation gathered for the Sunday service, and Marion walked out through the south porch door into the September morning, the air cool and smelling of the end of summer, the hedgerows beginning their turn toward autumn, with the work bag over her shoulder, and the piece inside it, and the melody that was now fully, finally, completely hers to carry. Not because she owned it, because she had been the one who found it, and because she had carried it long enough and far enough, and brought it to its source, and then returned to the place it lived, and given it voice. That was enough. That was, she thought, exactly enough. She was an organ tuner. She had been, for 23 years, the person who listened to what instruments needed and gave it to them, who went into the dark interiors of things and found what was there and adjusted it by fractions until the relationships were right, who tuned not individual pipes, but the spaces between them, who understood that the work was not the pipe. The work was the relationship. The work was always the relationship. She walked home through the September morning, and the 8 bars moved with her. Not just 8 bars now, but the whole piece, complete, from the quiet opening to the 3 descending notes at the end. Alice Redmond's song, Evelyn Marsh's keeping, Marion Cross's finding, 3 women and a piece of music, and a strip of metal in the back of a church organ, in a small Cambridgeshire village. That was all. That was everything. And now, dear listener, it is time for you to rest. You have followed Marion through the early mornings and the organ cases, through the February cold and the April light and the September quiet of a church that had just held a song. You have been in the back of the swell case when she found it. You have sat in a small Norwich parlour and heard the whole piece played. You have carried the 8 bars with her across the months and understood what it means to carry something until you find where it belongs. Let your breathing slow now. Let the melody settle. Let whatever the day put into the dark spaces between things rest there quietly until morning. You do not need to resolve everything tonight. Some things are 8 bars from the middle of something. Some things are complete, and you will find it in time. Both of these are true at once. Both are enough. Close your eyes. St. Etheldreda's is quiet. The swell case is closed. The strip of metal is in the dark between the pipes, where Evelyn Marsh placed it in 1871. The melody is in the air of the church, where Marion sang it this morning. The stone holds it. the way stone holds warmth, slowly released, long after the source is gone. You are cared for, you are held, the relationships are right. Sleep now. Tomorrow the instruments will speak again. Tomorrow the work will continue. And somewhere in the back of something that is waiting to be opened, something is being kept for you. Good night. She did not tell anyone, not the vicar, who was grateful as always for a well-tuned instrument, and interested as always in very little beyond his sermon, not the verger, who arrived while she was descending from the loft, and who nodded and began his preparations as though nothing out of the ordinary had occurred, which, from the verger's perspective, nothing had. She thought about whether to tell Evelyn Marsh that she had returned to Fordwell, that she had stood in the swell case again, that she had sung the piece in the church. She wrote a letter, sat at her table in Cambridge on the Tuesday after the Sunday visit, and wrote to Miss Marsh on Collegate to tell her that the autumn tuning was done and the instrument was in good order. She wrote that she had returned to the swell case and found the strip undisturbed. She wrote that she had sat in the organ loft with the September light coming through the windows and sung the whole piece to the church. She wrote that it had sounded right, that the stone had held it, that she had felt it was the thing to do, and she believed Evelyn Marsh would understand why. She sent the letter. She did not know whether a reply would come. She had said what she had to say, and it had been said, and that was sufficient. A reply came 10 days later, short, in the careful handwriting of someone who writes few letters and takes particular care over the ones they write. Dear Miss Cross, thank you for telling me. I am glad it was you who found it. I am glad the organ held it well. I am glad the church received it. That was all, but it was everything it needed to be. Marion worked on through the autumn. The usual churches, the usual chapels, the cold mornings, and the keys under the stones by south porch doors. The smell of old wood and pipe metal that greeted her every time she opened a case. The silence that preceded careful work. The school hall in March had its harmonium repaired, not perfectly, but adequately. She tuned it. She wrote another note. She moved on. This was the texture of it. Each instrument, each visit, each careful incremental correction. The work did not change. The work was the work. It was what it had always been. The early mornings, the keys under the stones by south porch doors, the particular quality of a building that has been empty all night and holds its dark like something earned. The inside of cases, the smell of old cedar and metal pipe, the work of listening to what an instrument needed and giving it precisely that. But the work was also, now, this, a piece of music copied on folded pages in a work bag that went everywhere she went, a melody she could sing from memory, in any key, at any tempo, in any of the churches she worked in, or on any of the lanes between them. A connection between herself and Evelyn Marsh on Collegate, between both of them and a girl named Alice Redman, who had died in December of 1867, and never heard the piece that had been written for her. Between all three of them, and an organ in a small Cambridgeshire church that had held the heart of the piece in the dark for 13 years. Marion thought about Alice Redmond sometimes. Not often, not with the sustained attention of grief, which was not hers to feel, but with the particular kind of awareness that comes when you have been entrusted with something that belonged to someone else. The awareness that you are not the beginning or the end of the story, only a chapter of it. A chapter in the middle, perhaps. She smiled at this. The 8 bars had come from the middle. Perhaps that was where she belonged in it. In the middle, the part that kept the whole from falling apart. The part that held the beginning and the ending in their right relationship to each other. That was what a tuner did, after all. Not the beginning, not the ending, the ongoing maintenance of the relationship between the parts. The work that had to be done again and again, as long as the instrument was played. Not glamorous, not remembered in the way of composers or performers. Necessary, more necessary perhaps, than the work that got the recognition. She walked home from the station on a November evening. The Cambridge streets were full of students and the smell of coal fires and the early dark of late autumn. She walked at her usual pace, unhurried, steady, the pace of someone who has been walking for 23 years, between trains and organs and the keys under the stones by South Porch doors. She was 46 years old. She had been doing this work since she was 23. She would do it until she could not. And in all the organ cases she would open between now and then, all the swells and grates and pedal boards, all the old pipes and new pipes and pipes that needed replacing, she would look, not expecting to find, but looking, because the strip had taught her that the inside of a case was a place where things were sometimes kept, and that the tuner was the person who went in and found them. She arrived home. She hung her coat. She put the kettle on. She sat at her table and took the folded pages from the work bag and set them in front of her. Then she sang the piece, as she did most evenings now, not from habit exactly, from something more like gratitude, for the finding, for the keeping, for the fact that she was the one who had been there on that February morning when the lamp in the back of the swell case had finally found what had been waiting in the dark.